Have you ever noticed something strange about meetings? So the meeting ends, right? And everyone says goodbye, and then two people stay behind. They start talking quietly near the door, and then later that afternoon, a message pops up. And then the next day, a decision appears that looks a little different from what the room seemed to agree on. If you've worked in an organization long enough, you've probably seen this happen. The meeting ends, but the real conversation, that's just getting started. And that's what I like to call the meeting after the meeting. In a lot of organizations, that's where the real decisions actually begin to take shape. If you only watch the official meeting, you're going to miss a lot of what's actually happening, right? And we tend to assume that meetings exist to make decisions, right? But in practice, that's rarely their main job. Now, most meetings are doing something quieter. They're testing alignment. People are watching reactions. Who hesitates? Who jumps in quickly? Who suddenly becomes very, very quiet? And maybe most importantly, who actually seems invested in the outcome? Because these signals tell you a lot about what might happen after everyone leaves the room. Now, in many cases, the meeting itself is not the decision. It's the moment where everyone reads the room. During a meeting, people pick up on smaller things, right? So, who sounds unusually enthusiastic, who avoids committing to anything, and who nods along but never says a word. And sometimes the quietest people in the room are actually sending the most interesting signals. The loudest agreement doesn't always tell you where the real friction is. It just kind of tells you like who's comfortable speaking in public. And because everyone is watching for those signals, the room is like less about deciding something and more about figuring out where everyone really stands. Now, once the meeting ends, the tone changes. People talk more freely. They ask questions they didn't want to raise in front of everyone. Things like, is this actually feasible? Who's going to own this? Do we really want our team attached to this decision? Those quieter conversations often carry more weight than the public discussion. They're small, they happen off stage, but they shape what actually moves forward. Now, imagine a product kickoff meeting. Everyone is nodding, the slides are moving along, everything seems smooth. Then, after the meeting ends, someone asks a question in the hallway. Has anyone thought about how this would actually work with the current system? Now, suddenly, a hidden problem appears. Something nobody raised during the official discussion. And it's not because like people were trying to hide it, but it's because the meeting itself wasn't the easiest place to bring it up. So the real conversation starts afterward. And then once you notice this pattern, meetings start to look very different. Because what you're really seeing is like a two-stage process. So first, there's the public meeting, and that's where ideas are introduced and reactions are tested. Then comes the second stage. It's the smaller conversations that happen afterwards. And that's where people like clarify their positions, they test concerns privately, and they try to figure out like what they're actually willing to support. Now, by the time the final decision appears, a lot of that alignment has already happened quietly in those smaller conversations. Now, this isn't like corporate maneuvering, though. It's more like human nature, if you think about it. People protect their reputations, they want to hedge risk, and they test ideas in like smaller settings before committing to anything publicly. And it's much easier to like say what you really think in a conversation with two people than in a room with 15. So decisions often form gradually. It's not in one big moment, but through a series of smaller conversations. And people who navigate organizations well tend to watch for different signals. They notice who lingers after the meeting, who follows up later, and like which discussions quietly move forward, and who ends up included in those conversations. And then sometimes, like, nothing happens at all. And even that silence can tell you something because it suggests the room was like already aligned. And once you start paying attention to this dynamic, you'll notice something else. Sometimes the people who influence the final outcome weren't the most vocal in that meeting. They might have actually said very little, but afterward, they're the ones people quietly check in with. quick message or like a follow-up conversation, or like it's one of those things like where people ask like, I just want to get your take on something, that kind of moment, right? And that's often a signal that others see them as an important signal reader, someone whose opinion shapes what happens next. And then when several of these small conversations start pointing in the same direction, the eventual decision can almost feel inevitable. By the time it becomes official, the real alignment has already happened. Now, one reason this dynamic can feel frustrating is that most organizations talk about decisions as if they happen in the meeting itself. The agenda suggests that's where things are supposed to be finalized, right? But in reality, the meeting is often just the visible part of the process. What people see is the formal discussion. What they don't see are the quieter conversations around it. That quick follow up message or a short call between two team leads, that private conversation where someone says, now, before we move forward with this, there's something we should probably think about. Those smaller moments rarely show up on a calendar, but they're often what the real clarity emerges, right? And once you realize that, meetings start to feel less confusing because you stop expecting the entire decision to happen in one public moment. Instead, you start to see it as something that unfolds gradually across several conversations. So the next time a meeting ends, don't assume the process is finished. And sometimes the most important signals appear after everyone else leaves. Hallway conversation, quick message, follow up call. And in many organizations, the real meeting begins when the official one ends. And once you start noticing those moments, meetings stop feeling mysterious and you start to see how decisions actually take shape, often quietly, off stage, but very often after the meeting ends.